Episode 11, Part 06, Chapter 11. Chapter 11. 2 hours had passed by before the group finally saw their first sights of Rocket Town. They thought they would never reach the town, and were immensely relieved as they passed the small hill and saw the town standing in the middle of the fields, probably no more than a few miles away. The journey had proved much more tiring than they had first thought. 2 long, agonizing hours had been spent in the blazing sunlight. No sooner had they stepped away from the mountains did the breeze shift its direction so that it no longer blew from the west. Nor was there any comforting shadow from the mountains, for as the sun moved further to the west it pushed away the shadows of the mountains, leaving them only with hot, tiring sunlight. Even Eris had lost her thrill for the light and the warmth, her boots tied loosely around her neck so that her feet could cool down against the soft stalks of grass. True to form, Cat had got his information completely wrong. The 1-hour journey he had promised had quickly extended as they headed across the Kyutai plains, with no sign of any town anywhere. Cat blamed the mistake on the fact that he was calculating how long it would take them to travel by buggy, except that they had left the buggy outside of Nibelheim. And as Barrett chased the cat and Mog across the fields, his anger fueled by the heat, the cat shouted, "It's not my fault. I'm just a simple fortune teller." At which point Barrett had replied in a fit of rage, "I ain't gonna need a fortune teller to predict your future." The Nibel wolves that stalked the Kyutai plains hadn't made the journey any easier, either. The small pack of wolves had been following Cloud and the others ever since they exited the winding paths of Mount Nibel, waiting for the right time to attack. They found that time about an hour later, when the group sat down in the middle of the field to fuel themselves with water and food they had picked up in Nibelheim. They had attacked in a sudden, vicious onslaught, but everyone remained surprised at how easily they had been dealt with. It would most certainly stick in their minds as one of their most bizarre victories to date. In fact, no one even noticed the wolves arriving, until Eris had suddenly stood up, staff in hand, and held it out level in front of her. As the bearer of the Choco/Mog materia, Eris had expected the comic duo of Chocobo and Mog to emerge from the materia and simply chase off the beasts approaching them. Yet, as the materia flashed with a deep red passion and ejected a thin red line of light into the air that flew up and burst with a puff of white smoke, she realized that something else was happening. The underside of the cloud rippled and then parted as something large and yellow dropped down from within. It was at this point that the others noticed what was going on and looked up, their eyes wide as they saw the yellow creature that was being dropped from the cloud. The creature was a chocobo, but not the usual kind. This chocobo was large, much larger than any chocobo they had ever seen. It was also incredibly fat, its body like a large, bulbous ball of skin, feathers, and fur. Even its face was fat, humorous eyes looking out from a podgy little face. The wolves were still running at that point. They did not notice the giant shadow that had suddenly formed above them and was gradually growing bigger as they ran. It was only within the last few seconds before the fat chocobo hit the ground with an almighty thud that the wolves finally spotted it and swerved aside. One wolf did not manage to run aside in time. The giant body of the fat chocobo landed directly on top of it, squashing the beast under its heavy bulk. Only its tail could be seen twitching at one side, the rest of its body pressed beneath the summon monster. The rest of its pack had fled in fear, leaving their companion behind to the fate of the fat chocobo. The fat chocobo had then smiled happily with its tiny little beak, and then dispersed back into the air in a second puff of white smoke. It left behind the Nibel wolf, lying flat against the grass in a groove made from the chocobo's form. It was still alive, albeit unconscious, but it would certainly take a while to recover. With the Nibel wolves removed, the group quickly chose to move on, the sight of the fat chocobo still fixed in their minds as the most bizarre summon they had seen and would probably ever see. Not surprisingly, the wolves did not bother them again, and they were free to enter Rocket Town. Rocket Town. The group was very surprised as they passed through the gates of Rocket Town and stood on its dusty path. Surprised because there was no sign of the Shinra or even a Mako reactor anywhere within the whole town, from what they could see. There were even people walking around, people who did not carry the usual expressions of sadness and misery that they had seen in so many previous towns like Gongaga and North Corel. The people of this town appeared to be normal, unaffected by the effects of the Shinra. Some people even managed to give the group a warm, welcoming glance as they entered the town. The town itself was plain and simple enough. There was a bar, an inn, a weapon, and an item shop, all the usual homes and shops they expected to see in a small town. Although they did notice that the homes looked in quite good condition, unlike the older homes they had seen in many other towns, all shabby and run down. Perhaps they hadn't, because Cloud felt certain that on the older world maps he had seen this town hadn't been placed on it. It almost felt a little strange entering a town that apparently seemed unaffected by the Shinra. They had become so used to seeing miserable faces and hearing stories of loss and broken promises that they expected it, even in this town. Cautiously and somewhat uneasily, Cloud and the others stepped forward into the town. At any moment they expected to turn a corner and see the ruins of another failed reactor, or a mass graveyard, or something that showed any signs of misery caused by the Shinra. Cloud turned his head from left to right, very nearly desperate to spot something that related to the Shinra. He got his answer when he looked right ahead towards the strange structure that they had seen out in the Kyutai Plains. "What's that?" he exclaimed, pointing up the structure. Everyone looked up, and was just as surprised as Cloud was. In the distance they had thought the structure to be nothing more than a tall building, but up close it was clear that this was not the case. It was actually a rocket, a very old and worn rocket at that. It was made of strong, sturdy bronze metal that had become so rusted with age that most of the color was gone. Instead of standing upright like a normal rocket, this one was slowly tilting onto its side, held up only by the edges of the metal pillars that surrounded it. Yet even those were failing, gradually bending as the weight of the rocket pushed on them and pushed them aside. "A rusty old rocket," said Cloud as he gazed up at the rocket. "Wonder what they'd make something that huge for." While he spoke the others walked past him and strolled into the town, taking the time to explore. Cloud followed, eventually, after spending another minute or so gazing up at the leaning rocket. There was some writing on the side of the rocket that he couldn't make out, worn off with age, but Cloud didn't feel it was really that important to know. So, with nothing better to do than to wait, Cloud began to explore the town on his own. He saw the others as he walked, gathering information about the town from the townspeople. He even saw Barrett and Vincent inspecting the weapons shop near the entrance of town, although there was not much worth buying. There was some interesting stuff in the item shop, but that was all. Cloud left the item shop without buying anything, and stood in the middle of the town. From where he was he could see pretty much all of the town, the rocket to his left, the town's entrance to his right, and a few houses behind and ahead of him. There was also a quaint little house just ahead of him, but it didn't strike as important then, either. Suddenly getting the feeling that he was being watched, Cloud tensed up and looked to his left. He relaxed when he saw that it was an old man just sitting in a chair outside the weapon shop, gazing at him through old, grey eyes. They were not the eyes of someone who had been hurt tremendously over the years. Rather they were the eyes of a happy, content old man, gazing at the young man before him as though basking in some distant memory. When he had finished looking at Cloud, the old man turned away in his chair to look up at the rocket. Cloud was about to walk away when the old man suddenly said, completely out of the blue, "This used to be a Shinra base where they used to launch rockets." Cloud stopped where he was and looked back at the old man, wondering what had made him speak so suddenly. The old man didn't turn, and continued to look up at the rocket as he spoke again. Assuming the old man was talking to him, Cloud didn't move from where he stood. "You saw the leaning rocket, right? That's Shinra number 26. It never got off the ground though. It just looms there. That's how the town got its name. Shinra number 26. The old man slowly turned his head and looked at Cloud again, his grey eyes glimmering hopefully. "Want to look at the rocket with me?" Cloud stared uncaringly for a second, but then his face softened and he smiled. "Yeah, let's take a look," he said. The old man's face creased into a warm smile before he turned and looked up at the old rocket ahead of him. His face just seemed to lighten up the longer he gazed at the old thing, admiring its structure and the way it was perfectly balanced on the metal pillars. Although it was worn and old and so close to falling over, Cloud got the feeling that the old man could see something about the rocket that he couldn't. Something mystical? Perhaps magical? No? That was just silly. Eventually the old man sighed and climbed out of his chair, turning around to face Cloud. The smile remained on his face even as he stood, looking at Cloud with a certain admiration. "I get so impressed every time I look at it," the old man said cheerfully. "Sorry to get you into this. For me, it's a kinda hobby. But, out of appreciation, let me give you this." He reached out behind his chair and pulled out a sword. "I wish you would take care of it and use it." Cloud didn't say anything as he accepted the sword, closing his hand around the handle and holding it out in front of him. Despite its age it was a beautiful sword, and was much thinner than his sword. Yet, somehow Cloud got the feeling he wouldn't use the sword much, although he didn't feel right to refuse the man's kind gesture. It wasn't that Cloud didn't like the sword. It was a beautiful model, known as Yoshiyuki, and was in a sense more practical than his sword. Even so, Cloud didn't feel able to give up his Buster sword. He had used it ever since Midgar, and it held such a strong attachment to him that he couldn't explain it. So he just smiled at the old man, and placed the sword behind his back, hooking it alongside his Buster sword. The two swords together were heavier, but Cloud figured he could manage until he could find somewhere or someone to give the sword to. Someone who could use the sword, like the old man wanted. Leaving the old man to continue gazing at the old rocket, Cloud headed over to the inn back at the town's entrance. He figured that they would all need to gather sometime soon and discuss what they should do next. If the Shinra were heading west, then they should turn up sooner or later. He hoped. At least he now knew that the town did have a connection to Shinra, albeit a past connection. Cloud pushed open the door to the inn and walked boldly in. As he entered, he saw that the inn also doubled up as a bar as well as an inn, with the bar positioned to his right, while the innkeeper's desk was directly ahead. He wasn't interested in booking a room though, so instead he just turned and headed straight towards the bar. As he walked up he saw that he hadn't been the only one with the idea of waiting in the bar. Eris was there too, having a drink at one of the tables in the dim lighting. Red 13 was on the floor beside her, his tail swishing lightly between the legs of the table. Lastly there was Cat Shi, standing silently in the corner with his back to them. He was completely motionless, and Cloud figured maybe he had somehow turned himself off for a while to conserve his energy. Cloud did wonder what Cat ran on, if he was indeed mechanical. Cloud looked at Eris. She was sat quietly at the table, her finger lightly tapping the edge of the glass, like she was lost in thought. She looked at, too, her face in a very serious expression that Cloud rarely ever saw on her. Eris was always so light-hearted and cheerful around the others, but maybe she also had a lot of things on her mind that she didn't share. Cloud decided that maybe she wanted to be on her own, so instead of going over to her he went over to the bar, where the barman was polishing a glass behind the counter. "Would you like something to drink?" the barman asked without looking up at him. Cloud nodded. The barman put down the glass he was polishing and began to mix up a drink from various bottles that were lined up along the bar. Cloud watched him as he worked. Eventually, his thirst for knowledge about the town got the better of him as he asked the barman about the town. "Let me hear your story," he said. When the barman was finished mixing the drink, he placed the glass in front of Cloud. "Did you meet the captain already?" he asked in exchange, continuing to polish his glasses. "He's really the town's representative, so you should really talk with him." It wasn't the first time Cloud had heard the name captain mentioned. A number of people in the town had advised they talk to the captain about the town. Cloud didn't know whether they were just being evasive, or if they were just genuinely advising them to talk to this captain. Either way he really did seem like an important figure amongst the townspeople. "Better ask the captain about this town," another man piped up from one of the tables. "He's the one in charge of it." "Captain? Who's the captain?" Cloud asked. The man took a long, hard swig of his drink and swallowed it in one gulp. With the glass now empty, he put it on the table and turned to look up at Cloud. "The captain was a pilot when Shinra was still interested in their space program," he explained briefly. "He was going to be the world's first astronaut, but there was an accident. Ever since then, he's been wasting his life away here dreaming about going into outer space." Hearing what the man said made Cloud think. Perhaps this was the reason why Shinra were heading west. Was there something in Rocket Town that they wanted, or did the captain know something about Sephiroth? Either way it sounded like a safe bet that they find the captain and find out before the Shinra got there. Even so, Cloud couldn't help but ask. "Did you see a man in a black cape?" Cloud asked. The man leaned back in his chair, his hands behind his head. He thought seriously for a minute, before he eventually shook his head. "A man in a black cape," he repeated. "Nope. Don't know a thing about it." His answer seemed genuine enough, so Cloud had no real reason not to believe him. The man and the barman said no more, so Cloud quickly finished his drink and broke Eris from her thoughts, along with Red 13. Getting Cat back online took a few more minutes before the cat finally realized someone was shaking his body and looked up, confused. When he was awake they headed back out into the town again, rounding up the others before gathering outside the house that the townspeople pointed out to them as the captain's house. It was quite a quaint little house, with a dark tiled roof and 4 glass-paned windows that overlooked the town. There was no garden that they could see, but the small white fence that surrounded the house extended all the way to the very back of the house. When they looked they could see that it extended even further than that, and there was a glimpse of something pink and blue there. Ignoring the back garden for the moment, Cloud and the others went up to the front door and knocked gently. They waited a moment for an answer, and when they got none, Cloud knocked a little bit harder. Cloud tried the door handle, and was surprised to find that the door was unlocked. After a confirmation nod from each of the others, he opened the door fully and walked inside. The house was just as quaint inside as it was outside. It was nothing fancy. The living room/kitchen took up most of the house's interior, with 3 other doors leading to smaller rooms. There was a small circular table in the middle of the living room with 4 chairs around it, placed on a green rug that had lost most of its softness over the years.
"Doesn't look like anyone's here,"
said Tifa, as they looked around the living room. She was right. Although the other doors were shut so they couldn't see, there was no sound of anyone else in the house, unless they were being extremely silent. There was one other door in the house, hidden at the very back down a small passageway. It probably led to the back garden. Cloud remembered the strange object he had seen from his glimpse outside the house and headed for the back door. The door did indeed lead to the back garden of the house, and it was larger than they expected. The garden bordered onto a field that joined up with the rocket launch pad area. But it was what was in the garden that caught their attention. The pink and blue object they had seen from the front was a small plane. It was not a very fancy-looking plane, and most of the paint was worn and a little bit dirty with age, but it was still in good condition. The blue bit they had seen was its nose, and it had more blue bits patterned across it. It had a blunted nose rather than the usual smooth point, with the propellers on the wings. There was also a very familiar logo painted on the side. In spite of its age, it looked very airworthy, just perfect for traveling some distances.
"There's a Shinra logo on it,"
said Cloud. He walked up close to the plane and wiped away some of the dried dirt on the side of the plane, revealing the plane's name.
"Tiny Bronco. This is cool. I wonder if we can borrow it,"
said Tifa. Cloud nodded thoughtfully. If they could borrow the plane, then they could make excellent time on their journey, far better time than they had made with the buggy. With that plane, the 2-hour journey they had taken just to get to Rocket Town would have taken them no more than 20 minutes. Possibly less or more, depending on how fast the plane could fly.
"The Shinra always keep the most useful things to themselves. Let's steal it,"
snapped Barrett fiercely. The fiery glare was back in his eyes, fired up at the thought of stealing from the Shinra and making them squirm. Yuffie had the same glare in her eyes, her fingers twitching as she itched to make some trouble for the Shinra. Cloud sighed. They would never change.
May I help you?"
The group all tensed up and stood rigid in front of the plane as the soft and slightly trembling female voice spoke out to them. When the shock subsided, the group slowly turned around and saw a woman standing behind them, peering out at them through a pair of old glasses. She looked to be in her late 20s or perhaps early 30s, and was wearing a long, white lab coat. At first they thought she was a scientist, until they saw specks of oil on her face and hands. An engineer, maybe? Her brown hair was slightly scruffy, tied back in a rough ponytail to keep it away from her face, although a few strands managed to break free and hung over her face. She seemed friendly enough.
"No,"
Cloud replied, being the first to break from the shock-induced tautness.
"We're just looking at it."
The woman stared at him for a minute, before her mouth upturned into a smile.
"If you would like to use it, please ask the captain,"
she told him. Her voice had a very anxious, wavering tone to it, like she was nervous about speaking.
"The captain should be in the rocket. I'm Shara. And what are your names?"
"I'm Cloud," Cloud said, giving a nod. He looked round at the others, who had now all broken from their own nervous stances.
"Tifa. Nice to meet you." "I'm Barrett, of Avalanche." "I'm Eris. Nanaki, otherwise known as Red 13. "I'm Yuffie. Fortune-telling machine Catchy here." "Vincent. My occupation is..." "Forget it."
Cheryl looked round at the group of 8 and nodded. She smiled again, but there was a slightly disappointed look in her brown eyes, as though she was expecting them to be someone else. She mumbled wistfully, her voice muffled as she folded her arms and put one hand thoughtfully over her mouth.
"So you're not with the Shinra? I thought the approval for the reopening of the space program came."
Cloud's eyes opened wide. He exclaimed. So the Shinra were coming to Rocket Town, after all. What for? Sharon nodded again, the loose strands of her hair flying across her eyes.
"President Rufus is scheduled to come here,"
she explained to them as she wiped the strands aside.
"The captain's been so restless this morning."
The woman then turned away and headed back inside the house, leaving Cloud and the others standing outside in front of the plane. When she was gone and the door was shut, Cloud turned to face the others.
Rufus!
He exclaimed. Chibis, happy birthday to Cloud. Happy birthday to Cloud. Happy birthday dear Cloud. Happy birthday to Cloud. Hee hee. Cloud, Thanks. End of chapter. Episode 12, Part 06, Chapter 12. Chapter 12. The rocket seemed to be far taller up close than it did outside of the town. Cloud and the others never realized it until they were stood directly beneath it, overwhelmed by its size. It must certainly have been a fine rocket when it had been built, and a lot of effort had clearly been put in to keep the rocket in good condition. A lot of the rust had been scraped off, and the metal had been frequently polished. It was especially shinier that day, as though someone had scrubbed the metal for hours to make it look as good as possible. There was no sign of the captain as they approached the rocket. The only people they saw around the rocket were workers making final adjustments to the launch bay. Now there wasn't a single stray leaf or branch to be found around the rocket. Whatever was happening that day, the people were certainly making an effort to make the rocket and the town look presentable. Remembering Shara's words, Cloud and the others walked around to the side of the rocket, looking up for a way in. Halfway up one of the pillars they saw a metal platform leading straight to the rocket, where an open doorway could just be seen through the metal. And, from inside the doorway, they could hear the sounds of someone shouting angrily inside. One by one they made their way up the side of the rocket, using the ladder on the pillar. Only Red 13 and Cat She stayed behind, deciding they wouldn't waste their energy climbing up unnecessary ladders just yet. They waited at the bottom, resting on the ground, while the others headed into the rocket. The sound of the angry shouting became louder as they climbed up. They couldn't make out much of what was being said, other than that it was absolutely filled with frustration and anger, and certainly needed to cut out a swear word or two. Along with the shouting there came the furious clank of metal crashing onto metal, an extra sign to the air of sheer frustration that was radiating from inside the rocket. Stopping just outside of the door, Cloud and the rest of the group were almost afraid to step inside the rocket. Whoever this captain was, judging by the sound of his voice, he certainly didn't sound like he was in the best of moods. They waited nervously for a minute or two, and when the clanking sounds subsided, they plucked up the courage to peer round the doorway. There was a man standing just a few meters away from them, his back to them as he faced the wall, a wrench in his hand as he worked on tightening the pipes that ran along the floor. Although they couldn't see his face with his back turned, he was dressed in a thick blue jacket with the sleeves rolled right up to his elbows, and brown leather gloves on his hands that were slightly old and worn over the years. He had a head of short blonde hair that was pushed back by a set of air goggles strapped around his head. There was a cigarette packet lodged underneath the strap by his left ear, a single cigarette sticking up out of the packet waiting to be drawn. Looking around at the inside of the rocket, there didn't seem to be much to look at. There was a door leading to the cockpit and another door leading to the deeper depths of the rocket, but that was pretty much it. There was one thing of notice in the corridor, though. There was a long and fearsome spear lying on the floor by the man's feet. It was incredibly long and made of strong, polished wood, with an incredibly sharp metal point at the top, perfectly shaped for quick stabs and slashes. It seemed quite an unusual weapon to have lying around, since it was precarious in unsteady hands. In skilled hands, on the other hand, it could be an incredibly dangerous weapon. The man didn't notice them at first as Cloud and the others stepped through the doorway. He was far too busy cursing and mumbling loudly to himself to notice anything. It was only when Barrett stepped off the platform and onto the metal floor of the rocket with his huge, heavy boots stamping against the metal that he heard them. He looked up, surprised, and turned around to face them. His face was coarse and somewhat unshaven, and he had a single cigarette perched in his mouth. He looked to be in his early 30s, and his blue eyes glared at the group with a fierce gaze that seemed about to snap at any given second. He didn't look too impressed to see them either, for not even a flicker of a warm, welcoming smile appeared on his face, unlike the rest of Rocket Town.
"What are you guys doing here?"
The man snapped, so fiercely and on edge that it took the others completely by surprise and made them all jump back. No one answered at first. They were all taken aback by the man's sharpness and somewhat unwelcoming attitude. After a moment or two Eris nudged Cloud in the back between his shoulder blades, pushing him and urging him to speak for them. Cloud complied with Eris's insistent nudging eventually, for even he was a little bit anxious of the man's fierce demeanor.
"We heard the captain was here,"
he said. The man took the cigarette he had been smoking out of his mouth, threw it on the floor and stamped it out with his boot.
Captain?
He asked.
I'm the captain. The name's Sid. Everyone calls me captain though.
He pulled out the spare cigarette from the packet lodged underneath his goggles, lit it, and stuck it in his mouth.
What do you want?
Cloud was about to ask about the tiny Bronco, but he stopped before the words left his lips. He remembered the way Sid had been shouting before they entered. He thought it would be best to try and lighten his mood somehow. Perhaps ask about something that may just cheer him up slightly until they were ready to ask about borrowing the tiny Bronco.
Tell me about this rocket,
he said finally, guessing that the rocket was a good topic to start with. He guessed right. Sid's frustrated frown was lifted instantly, changing into a smile of happiness and surprise. He almost looked like a different person and it took them all by surprise to see such an instant change.
Wow. Not bad for a kid.
The elder man said.
Alright then, I'll explain it to you.
He put his wrench down on the ground beside his spear and faced the group.
You know Shinra developed a lot of technological gadgets during the meaningless war, right? Now it's a Mako company, but in the old days it was a weapons manufacturer. Well, they came up with a rocket engine. There was so much excitement about the thought of going into outer space. Our dreams got bigger and bigger. They put a major budget into it and made prototype after prototype. Finally, they completed Shinra number 26. They chose the best pilot in Shinra, no, in the world, me. I mean, come on. And we finally get to the day of the launch. Everything was going well.
All of a sudden Sid spun around and kicked the wall, making everyone jump. It carried such force that it made the corridor shake a little, and the sound of the kick echoed throughout the other empty corridors of the rocket. The happy smile had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by the deep, raging fury that was permanently on his face.
But, because of that dumbass Shara, the launch got messed up. That's why they became so anal.
He stared angrily at the wall as he shouted, until he realized just how much anger he was showing. He quickly recovered himself and turned back to them.
And so, Shinra nixed their outer space exploration plans. After they told me how the future was space exploration and get my dem hopes up. Damn them. Then, it was all over once they found out Mako Energy was profitable. They didn't even so much as look at space exploration. Money, moolah, dinero. My dream was just a financial number for them. Look at this rusted rocket. I was supposed to be the first man in space with this. Every day, it tilts a little bit more. At this rate, I don't know which will come first, this thing falling down or me getting out of here. My last hope is to talk to the president. Is Rufus coming?
Cloud asked. Sid responded by taking a large puff out of his cigarette. He blew out deeply, sending a cloud of grey smoke into the air, before putting the stick behind his right ear out of the way.
Yeah.
He replied, his mood starting to lift once again.
It must be news about restarting the space program. A young president, that's what we needed. He still has dreams, too.
Cloud and the rest of the group said nothing. Unfortunately they knew better. Whatever it was that Rufus was coming to Rocket Town for, it certainly had nothing to do with restarting the space program. And judging by the amount of effort that had been put into making the rocket look more presentable, Sid was going to be in for one heck of a disappointment. Cloud sighed heavily, and decided to ask the dreaded question.
Can we borrow the tiny Bronco?
The moment Sid heard the words borrow and tiny Bronco, his head snapped around and glared at Cloud with such a fierce intensity that Cloud felt himself shrink back inside. Clearly, he had struck a nerve.
You out of your goddamn mind?
Sid shouted.
That's my most cherished possession. I can't let you take it.
And to prove that that was the last he was going to say on the matter, Sid turned around, picked up his wrench from the floor and began to work again. He completely ignored the people behind him, and when Cloud tried to talk to him again he just banged the wrench on the pipes, drowning out his voice. Seeing that they weren't going to get anywhere with the stubborn air captain, the group had no choice but to go back down the rocket and back into town. The looks on their faces explained all to Red 13 and Cat as they all stepped off the ladder, and they slowly headed back into town and Sid's house. The house was completely empty as they went back inside, and they couldn't see Shara anywhere. However, they could hear sounds out back, so they presumed that Shara was in the backyard with the tiny Bronco. No doubt she was making the backyard look respectable in case Rufus did come. The group all stood silently in the living room, thinking. For the first time in their journey they had reached a dead end and didn't know where to head next. Even if they did borrow the tiny Bronco, where would they go with it? Further west, to the next small continent? Or up north, to the icy regions of the northern continent? Either way they still didn't know which way Sephiroth or Shinra were heading, so their best bet was probably to stick around until Rufus arrived and, hopefully, get a lead on their next destination.
Excuse me. Cloud.
Came Shara's voice. Everyone looked up as Shara stepped in from the outside. As they suspected, she had been clearing the backyard, for her long, white coat was lightly scraped in dirt and dead leaves that she had been shifting out of the way. More proof came from the brush and bag she held on her hands, the bag filled with leaves. Her hair was also a little more ruffled up than before, and her glasses were slightly crooked on her face.
Did the captain say anything?
She asked as she set the bag down on the ground, adjusting her glasses so they were back in place.
Nope.
Cloud said, sagging his shoulders. Shara didn't seem very surprised to hear that.
Oh.
She said, trying her best to sound a little surprised. But she didn't do a very good job of it. At that second the front door swung open, banging loudly against the wall of the house and making Yuffie jump out of her skin. Sid then stormed in from outside, his spear in his hand, and strolled into the living room. He looked at Cloud and then at the rest of the group one by one, grunted loudly, and then turned and glared furiously at poor Shara.
Shit. Shara. What are you, blind?
He shouted, pointing at Cloud and the rest of the group.
We got guests. Get some tea. Shit.
As the captain shouted, Shara flinched and shrank back, hiding half of her face in the collar of her coat. She quickly recovered and pulled herself out again, but her voice trembled nervously when she spoke.
I'm sorry,
she apologized quickly. She then hurried over towards the kitchen part of the living room and pulled out some mugs, turning on the kettle to make a pot of tea. The others watched as she worked as quickly as she could, but her hands were shaking so much that they expected her to drop a cup at any moment.
Really, don't mind us,
Cloud said, eyeing the way Shara was precariously trying to pour milk into half of the cups. He didn't want Shara to get into trouble because of them being there. Sid was at the wall then, hanging his spear up on the wall as though on display. When Cloud spoke, he could have sworn he saw Sid twitch, for he suddenly turned around and looked fiercely at Cloud.
Shut up.
He ordered sternly.
Sit your ass down and drink your goddamn tea. Argh. Damn, I'm pissed. Shara. I'll be in the backyard tuning up Tiny Bronco. And make sure to serve them some tea. All right.
With that remark said and done, Sid walked briskly past Barrett and Vincent and went straight out of the back door, slamming it shut behind him without a care. Like the front door, it shut with a slam that echoed throughout the house, making Shara jump again and almost dropping the bottle of milk.
Damn, man. What's up with that guy's attitude?
Commented Barrett. Cloud walked over to Shara.
Sorry,
he said.
It's our fault.
Shara put down the bottle of milk on the side of the worktop and turned around. She took off her glasses and wiped them on her coat, removing a speck of dirt from the frame. She looked much better without her glasses, they thought.
No,
she said to them.
He's always like this. Is it like this all the time?
Asked Eris, looking a little concerned.
You keep quiet even when he's like that to you.
She looked horrified as Shara nodded, wondering how on earth Shara could cope with a guy like that every day.
I think it's a bit too harsh,
said Red 13.
It's amazing that you can live with it,
said Vincent. They all tried to picture what it must be like for poor Shara. To live every day with a man who did nothing but yell at her, order her around and most likely criticize everything she did. They remembered vaguely in the rocket the way Sid had referred to her, that dumbass Shara. How could she possibly live like that? How could she just stand there and take that abuse and not say anything? They found themselves feeling a new sort of respect for Shara, for being able to live through it. Finished with rubbing her glasses clean, Shara put them back on, moving her hair out of the way so she could hook the thin frames over her ears.
No,
she said in answer to Red 13 and Vincent's comments.
It's because of my stupid mistake. I was the one who destroyed his dream.
One by one everyone looked at Shara.
What happened?
Asked Cloud.
Hey. Get your ass in gear. You work like a snail. Even the moon 'd get tired waitin' around for your ass. I'm sorry.
Shara worked as fast as she possibly could. She put her clipboard on the floor and opened up a small hatch in the side of the oxygen tank. Peering inside, she could see a large number of cables and wires that organized the flow of oxygen in the tank, keeping it steady so there wasn't an overflow. They were also the cables responsible for keeping the thick metal doors of the tanks securely shut, and it was this that she was looking at. She wasn't entirely happy with how the system was working. The other tanks she had checked seemed fine, but this one in particular looked like it had a malfunction. It was only slight, but Shara wasn't happy with it. Whenever she pushed the button to close the door, it always stayed slightly open, perhaps half a centimeter. And even though the oxygen was contained in another separate tank inside the first one that should contain it, in extreme heat it could possibly burst open. It was a very minimum risk, but she wanted to make sure it was absolutely perfect. Sid didn't seem to appreciate her caution. He stood behind her, looking over her shoulder with his usual irritated expression, perhaps more irritated now the big day had finally come. They had all been waiting many months for this day to arrive and were eager to complete all their tasks and get the big job underway. But, of course, Shara was lagging behind.
"Don't take so much time checking that goddamn oxygen tank,"
Sid snapped, folding his arms.
"Shara, being careful's good, but it won't do any good, no matter how many times you check that oxygen tank. That thing wouldn't break if hell froze over."
He tapped his foot impatiently on the floor, as though that somehow would make Shara speed up.
"But,"
Shara said. As she looked up, her finger fell on the wire she was checking, and she got a slight electric shock like she was touching the edge of a light bulb, making her wince. Already her finger was tingling and becoming slightly numb, but it had only been a small shock, nothing serious.
"No buts,"
Sid shouted, not noticing.
"You're not stupid, so be more efficient." "I'm sorry,"
Shara said quietly, cradling her tingling finger. Sid then turned and walked out of the engine room, leaving Shara alone to continue checking the rest of the oxygen tanks. Shara was an excellent engineer, but she was just so slow. Sid knew she was just being careful, but there was no point worrying over something so small. His mood soon lifted as he walked along the corridors leading to the cockpit. Here he was, Sid Highwind, one of the best pilots in all of Shinra, walking down the final paths to achieve his greatest dream. After so many months of waiting and failed experiments, Shinra number 26 was finally completed and ready to launch. It was only a matter of time now before the countdown would start, the engines would ignite and the pillars fell away, and the rocket would blast off into the sky and, finally, into outer space. Sid stopped as he felt the usual tingle of excitement bubble inside him, in his veins, and in his heart. He felt like a child going down a slide for the first time, getting the ecstatic thrill of moving at high speed, zooming towards the ground. Only this time he was doing the reverse. He was going up. Up, into outer space. Sid reached the corridor leading to the cockpit, where there were more workers just completing their final checks. The three men looked up as Sid approached, each with the same excited glow in their eyes and cheeks. Their hands were trembling with excitement as they all dropped their tools and ran to the captain, gathering around him with large smiles on their faces.
"Captain,"
one of the men exclaimed.
"Our dreams are finally coming true. We are so proud to be part of the launch of Shinra number 26,
the second man said.
"Captain, preparations are complete. All that's left is liftoff."
Hearing the words liftoff, Sid felt his excitement rise again. Unfortunately for these men, they would not be on board when Shinra number 26 blasted off, but the mere pride of having worked on the rocket leading up to its launch was enough for them. As for him, he would be sitting in the cockpit watching the ground rush by. He would be the one to see the planet from miles above, amongst the stars.
Yeah,
he said, struggling to contain his eagerness.
Leave it all to me. I'll be back in a few.
The three men all suddenly ran away from the captain and stood against the walls of the corridor. Facing inwards, they came to attention and saluted proudly. Sid stared at them for a second, before he began to march proudly down the center of the line past the saluting men. He felt so proud and so exhilarated as he passed them by. Nothing could possibly go wrong now.
All right, Captain,
the men all said in unison as they saluted him.
Fly our dreams into outer space. Thanks, guys.
Sid stopped in front of the door leading into the cockpit, and turned back to the men. He blinked as though he had forgotten something, until he clicked his fingers and delved into his pocket. He pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes and quickly pushed them under the band of his goggles. Now everything was perfect.
We're praying for your safety,
the men added finally, just as Sid turned around and walked through the open door. Standing alone in the empty cockpit, Sid felt as though he was in space already. The cockpit was dark, quiet, and serene, apart from the gentle hum of the engines below. He could feel them vibrating through the floor. Somehow those vibrations calmed his excited nerves. Or maybe he was just so excited that his senses were dimmed, making him appear calm and collected. The pilot seat was right ahead, positioned in front of the main control panel, awaiting him. That was his throne from which he would look down upon the planet. It was not a fancy chair, just plain metal, but to Sid it might as well have been made of pure, solid gold, sparkling in the twilight. The nervousness hit Sid as he slipped quietly into the chair and looked down at the control panel. This was really it. The moment was really arriving, at long last. His dream. It was finally coming true. He glanced down at his hand and saw that it was shaking from his excitement. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes, so he stilled his hand and quickly checked over the panel.
Instrument panel. All clear,
Sid said, speaking into the open intercom and trying to control the anxious quiver in his voice.
Shinra number 26, ready for launch.
He paused and took a breath, although when the intercom crackled and a voice spoke back to him, he tensed up again.
Engine pressure rising. Shinra number 26, 3 minutes to launch. Beginning countdown.
Finally, said Sid. He leaned back in the chair and looked up at the ceiling, taking deep, relaxing breaths to calm his nerves. Precision and timing was vital. All it took was one mistake and the launch would either end in disaster, or be cancelled completely. He couldn't wait another 6 months or so for this moment. He was just beginning to relax when the emergency lights suddenly came on, followed by the loud and angry whir of the siren. Sid almost jumped out of his chair, gripping the armrests tightly.
What happened?
He cried. The intercom crackled again, and the panicked voice of the base control officer came through.
Sid. We have an emergency situation. A mechanic is still in the engine section of the rocket.
End of chapter. Episode 13, Part 06, Chapter 13. Chapter 13. Sid almost jumped right out of his pilot seat.
What?
He raged, his voice clearly audible over the sirens. His pack of cigarettes slipped from under his goggles as he moved, and tumbled down onto the floor at his feet. He almost asked the controller to repeat what he had said, because he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Right then, so close to the launch, everyone should have been evacuated from the rocket apart from himself. Sid couldn't believe someone would be stupid enough to remain inside the rocket when it was about to blast off. Sid shook his head and punched down on the intercom button.
"Who is the little asshole?"
he demanded angrily. The intercom crackled again and the controller's voice came through. He sounded a little panicky as well.
"I don't know,"
he replied.
"Activating the intercom in the engine section."
Sid tapped his fingers anxiously on the control panel, waiting for the red light signaling the connection to flash on. Inside the engine room, Shara knelt down beside the oxygen tank and peered inside. No, it still wasn't right. No matter what she tried, the ceiling door always remained open just a few millimeters. She had tried adjusting the door settings, maneuvering the wires around, tightening the bolts and other things, but each time she repeated the simulation it always turned out the same as before. Those same few millimeters that just refused to close. All the other doors were perfectly sealed, protecting the vital oxygen tanks inside. She sighed, frustrated, and wiped away the sweat on her forehead before picking up her wrench and attempting to tighten the bolts further. When all the other mechanics and engineers had left the rocket, Shara had originally left with them. Still, the oxygen tanks had played on her mind, so while everyone was busy evacuating the rocket, she had slipped back inside and continued her experiments. She was determined to fix the problem, even if it meant still being inside the rocket when it blasted off. As she was busy working on the tank, the intercom speaker above the door crackled and came to life. Seconds later, Sid's angry voice came booming into the engine room.
"Hey, goddammit!"
his voice shouted.
"Who the fuck's still in there?"
Shara put down her wrench and stood up, looking up at the intercom.
"It's Shara, Captain,"
she called up to him.
"Don't mind me, go ahead with the launch."
She could hear Sid's voice splutter through the intercom.
"Shara?"
he called back, sounding even angrier than before. Not that Shara could blame him for sounding angry. She could picture him at the controls, gripping the panel in frustration, screaming down the microphone at her.
"What are you still doing in there?"
"I was still concerned," Shara replied to him calmly, in contrast to Sid's voice yelling at her.
"The results of the oxygen tank test weren't satisfactory." "You stupid little bitch! It's gonna get so hot in there that there ain't gonna be shit left when we blast off,"
Sid told her through the intercom.
"You're gonna be burned to a crisp. You're gonna die. You know that, don'tcha?"
Shara lowered her head and looked at the metal floor. She did know how hot the engine room was going to get during liftoff, and that she would most likely die if she stayed in there. Yet somehow, in some weird way, she wasn't afraid of it. It wasn't that she was suicidal or anything like that. It was just that, as long as the launch was a success and Sid got to fulfill his dream and go up into outer space, then she didn't really mind sacrificing her life for it.
"I don't mind,"
she said, smiling softly.
"If I can just fix this, the launch will be a success. I'm almost done."
She turned back and knelt by the pod again, picking up her wrench and continuing the work she was desperate to finish. She didn't have much further to go to complete the work. She needed a little more time.
"Almost done?"
Sid cried, unable to believe his ears.
"You're gonna die." "Sid, we must start the countdown,"
came the controller's voice, also through the intercom like Sid's.
"We won't make it if we don't." "Starting engine."
A loud rumble began to grow from deep within the rocket, rising up from the ground all the way up to the cockpit where Sid was glaring at the intercom. He exclaimed as he felt the strong vibrations of the engine shaking underneath his feet. Realizing that Control was serious about starting the countdown, he frantically grabbed the microphone, nearly pulling it out of its stand.
"Hey, wait a minute!"
he yelled.
"Shara's still in here. What are you going to do, Sid?"
asked the controller.
"If we cancel now, it'll be another 6 months until the next launch."
Sid grunted loudly and pounded the edge of the control panel with his fist. The thud could barely be heard through the growing rumbles from the engine room. As they continued to grow, Sid stared down at the control panel, watching as more buttons on the control panel began to light up as the rocket began to start up. He wished that Shara would hurry up and say she was finished, because if she didn't then Sid would have no choice but to cancel the launch. He didn't know if he could wait another 6 months for the next launch. But if he didn't cancel it then...
"Goddamit, Shara! You wanna make me a murderer?" "Captain!"
Sid hurriedly leapt up and grabbed the microphone again.
"Shara?"
Shara's voice came crackling in through the intercom, heavy with static and barely audible through the loud rumbles coming from the engine room.
"Tank number 7 check is complete,"
came her meek voice.
"Once I complete tank number 8, it's all clear." "Come on, Shara,"
Sid said quietly.
"Hurry up. You're gonna die."
He closed his eyes tightly, his hands trembling over the controls. He just didn't know what to do. His anxiety wasn't helped when the intercom buzzed again, and controller's voice came through to him.
30 seconds until ignition. Beginning countdown. Sid. Forget about her. We won't make it in time."
Slowly Sid let himself sink back into his pilot seat, feeling the cold, harsh reality begin to sweep itself over him. He clutched onto his head and shook it fiercely, small specks of tears squeezing out from between his eyelids as he tugged the short lengths of his hair furiously. Opening his eyes, Sid glanced over towards the control panel. Just by the intercom was a red button that was flashing brightly, standing out against the other buttons. The emergency shutdown switch, the only button that could cancel the launch. If he pushed that then Shara would be safe, but then the launch. Sid lifted his head and shook it fiercely, tugging his hair even harder than before.
"What? What am I? What am I supposed to do?"
he asked aloud. There was no one to answer him, and all he could do was sit and hope that by some miracle Shara would finish quickly and get out to safety.
15 seconds until ignition. Internal temperature rising.
Sid could imagine what was happening in the engine room right then. Shara would still be at the oxygen tanks, beginning to sweat as the temperature from the engines began to rise. Pretty soon it would rise to unbearable temperatures, and Shara would start to suffocate from the heat, her body growing hot. She would be safe for a few seconds after liftoff, before the burners kicked in and propelled the rocket up off the ground. Then the temperature would soar dramatically, and Shara would simply burn into a crisp. If anything would be left of her at all.
"Oh man,"
Sid groaned loudly, trying to get the image of Shara's struggling, burning form out of his mind.
"The moon. Outer space. My dreams."
The intercom crackled one final time, and the controller's voice came booming out.
"Ignite engine."
It was in that split second that Sid finally made up his mind, bolting upright in his chair and pulling his goggles from his head.
Sh it!
He roared, and brought his fist firmly down on the flashing red button. Just as he pushed the button, a loud blast erupted around the base of the rocket. A wave of smoke and fire burst out from the engines, blowing out into the thin forest that surrounded the launch pad. The 4 metal pillars that held the rocket up released their latches and fell back, giving the rocket the space to launch. It did so, the large metal body slowly beginning to push up away from the ground, propelled by its powerful engines. It probably got no more than 15 meters off the ground before a loud droning sound could be heard from the engines, and then suddenly stopped. The smoke stopped flowing, and the rocket almost seemed to hover in the air over the launch pad. Then it began to fall. It landed with a very loud and heavy thud that made the ground and the pillars shake violently. The gust it created as it landed sent the surrounding smoke spiraling into the forest, whipping between the trees until it gradually dispersed into the air. There were a few moments of silence after the rocket landed, standing menacingly over the forest. When those few moments had passed, a loud creaking noise could be heard, and the rocket slowly began to tilt over towards its side. It almost threatened to fall over onto the forest, but thankfully one of the metal pillars just stood in its way and caught the rocket as it tilted. It came to a stop, but was balanced so precariously that no doubt it would fall eventually. A lot of time passed by, but no one ever bothered to take down Shinra number 26. Even when all the trees were cut away, and houses and shops were built around it, the rocket still stood there, looming over the town, still threatening to fall. That was how the town of Rocket Town was born. Shara folded her arms tightly against her chest, a small tear forming in her eye at the memory of that day.
He pushed the emergency shutdown switch, aborting the mission, to save my life, she said. After that, the space program was cut back and the launch was cancelled. It's my fault his dream was destroyed.
The tear fell and rolled down her cheek, and she hurriedly wiped it away with her sleeve.
That's why. It's all right. I don't care what the captain says. I'll live my life for him.
It was indeed a very moving story, and certainly touched the hearts of everyone standing in the living room. Only Yuffie seemed unaffected by the story, for she had chosen to ignore Shara's story and was busy snooping around the rest of the house with interest. She was searching for materia, no doubt, and had no time for petty stories that held no moral for her. Shara spotted some tear water on her glasses, and pulled them off to wipe them dry. While Yuffie was busy looking around the corridor leading to the backyard, the door suddenly burst open. She leapt back as it slammed against the wall and Sid came strolling in, flicking a cigarette out of the door as he came in. As he entered the living room, he looked around for a second, before glaring at poor Shara angrily.
Shara! You still haven't served MT. I'm sorry,
Shara apologized quickly. She pushed her glasses hurriedly back on her face and turned back to the boiling kettle and beginning to pour the hot water into the mugs, along with the milk. Soon the smell of piping hot tea filled the house. No one said anything as she worked. They were remembering the story Shara had told them, and slowly beginning to understand why Shara never said anything about the captain's aggressive behavior. Now they could understand why Sid seemed so angry about everything, and it certainly explained his behavior towards Shara. Still, it seemed a bit too harsh, as Red 13 had said. While Shara hurried about finishing the tea and handing out the few mugs that were ready, Sid walked over and sat at the table. He tapped his fingers irritably against the wood, tapping out a faint but catchy tune. He stopped tapping long enough to look up at Cloud and the others.
Hurry up and sit down,
he commanded.
Or ain't my hospitality good enough for you?
At his command, the others immediately sat down. Yuffie moved first, foregoing anxiety and leaping straight into another chair at the table. Eris and Tifa sat with her, sipping their mugs of tea meekly without a word. There were no other chairs, so the others had no choice but to stand, but Sid never said anything more to them. After a moment or two, Sid pushed back his chair and leaned back. He brought his feet up and placed them on the table, tapping them gently in place of his fingers. He checked his watch again and grunted loudly.
They're late,
he grumbled.
Where is Rufus?
No one replied to him. They just sat silently, slowly drinking their tea. At that moment there was a loud knock on the front door, before it burst open and a man in a yellow suit came strolling in. Everyone recognized him instantly. They remembered his bulbous figure back in Midgar, in the president's office after his assassination. It was Palmer, the man in charge of Shinra's space program.
Hey.
Palmer said loudly, brushing rudely past Cloud and Barrett into the living room.
Long time no see. So Sid, how you been?
Looking up, Sid swung his legs off the table and stood up in a single, fluid motion. He now blanked the others and ran over to Palmer, looking him briefly up and down.
Well, if it ain't Fat Man, Palmer,
he said gruffly.
How longer were you figuring on keepin' me waitin'? So? When's the space program gonna start up again? Hey. I don't know.
Palmer said hurriedly, waving his arms rapidly in front of him. He then stopped and pointed outside the front door.
The president's outside, so why don't you ask him?
Sid's face crunched up into an expression of fury, and his right eyebrow twitched as he glared angrily at Palmer.
Fuck.
He spat.
Good for nothing, fat fucker.
He pushed Palmer aside, grabbed his spear, and ran out of the door. Palmer waved his arms about frantically as he tried to stop himself from spinning into the door. When he stopped spinning he turned towards the door, his fist shaking angrily.
Don't say fat!
He shouted, but Sid was already gone. He sighed heavily and looked inattentively around the room. His eyes passed over Cloud and the others without a flicker of recognition, and settled on the kettle that was still steaming behind Shara. He ran over to her.
Hey. Tea!
He exclaimed.
Can I have some too? With lots of sugar and honey and... Oh yeah, don't forget the lard.
He licked his lips dreamily, despite the horrified and sickened gazes of Cloud and his group around him. While Shara began to brew up Palmer's very odd idea of tea, Cloud put down his own mug and sidled over towards the door. In his rush Sid had left the door slightly open, and he could see out into the town. Cloud pressed himself against the wall and peeked through the small crack, careful not to be seen. He could see Sid easily, standing with his back to them in the middle of the town. President Rufus was in front of him, talking to Sid about something that Cloud couldn't hear just yet. There was also a single blue-uniformed soldier nearby, staying close to Rufus. That struck Cloud as odd, but then Rufus probably didn't suspect that Cloud and the others were already in Rocket Town, and didn't need more guards. Cloud dared to open the door a little more and look a little further, trying to make out what they were saying. Meanwhile the others in the house were all silent, listening and watching Cloud carefully. Cloud wondered when Sid was going to find out that the space program wasn't restarting. He soon got his answer.
What they?
Came Sid's surprised and angry voice, now lifted so Cloud and everyone in the house could easily hear him.
You got me all excited for nothing? Then, what did you come here for? I want to borrow the tiny Bronco,
Rufus replied, much more calmly, seeming unfazed by Sid's angry shouts.
We're going after Sephiroth. But seems like we've been going in the wrong direction. But now, we think we know where he's headed. But, we have to cross the ocean. That's why we want your plane. God damn it!
Sid cursed, his fists tightly clenched and shaking.
First the airship, then the rocket, and now, the tiny Bronco. Shinra took outer space away from me and now you want to take the sky away from me, too.
Rufus shook his head pitifully, and moved a strip of blonde hair from his eyes.
Oh my!
He said.
You seem to forget that it was because of Shinra, Inc. that you were able to fly in the first place. What?
Sid raged. His fists were twitching, trying to hold back the urge to land a furious blow on the smug young man's face. With the guard nearby he couldn't do anything, so he just had to contain his anger. While this conversation was going on, Cloud continued to watch from the crack in the door. Although he could hear Sid's voice easily, he couldn't hear Rufus very well, and couldn't make out what the president was saying. He got the impression that Rufus was also after the tiny Bronco, judging from Sid's outraged cries. He was interrupted from his watch when a hand gently patted him on the shoulder, and a nervous-looking Shara gazed at him.
Excuse me.
This way, she said, motioning Cloud back inside the house. Cloud complied, shutting the door behind him and following Shara back into the living room.
You wanted to use the tiny Bronco, right?
She asked him. Cloud nodded.
I believe Palmer's going to take it. Why don't you talk to him?
Everyone jumped and looked around the room. Sure enough, Palmer was gone, his estranged mug of tea still sitting on the worktop. No one had noticed him slip away, they had been far too busy listening to Sid outside to notice. They almost kicked themselves for their stupidity, but there was no time for that. They needed to stop Palmer from taking the tiny Bronco. They ran through the back door and into the yard where the tiny Bronco was resting. Sure enough, Palmer was there, climbing over the plane's ample frame, messing around with the controls and muttering to himself.
Why do I have to do this? I'm the head of the space program. We'll be taking that tiny Bronco,
said Cloud. Palmer froze, his fingers hovering above the controls. Slowly, he turned around and saw Cloud and the rest of the group gathered around the plane, looking up at him. Palmer's eyes squinted as he looked back down at them, and for the first time the faint flickers of recognition slowly began to appear on his rounded face.
I've seen you somewhere before,
he said, unsurely. He stared at Cloud and Barrett a few seconds more, scratched his head, and then clicked his fingers.
I know. The Shinra building. When the president was killed.
He suddenly froze again as the full memory came back to him in a flash.
Ulp. S.E. Say. Security.
Of course, no one was there to answer him. Realizing this, Palmer instead reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small gun that had been hidden in his inside pocket. Cloud recognized it as a Mako gun, a gun that utilized the power of Mako. The Mako energy within it was not as condensed as materia, and flowed freely to create magical waves of fire, ice, or even sometimes lightning. Without even a consideration for where he was aiming, Palmer pointed the gun down and fired. A stream of Mako energy came pouring from the tip of the gun, firing out in a long, continual stream. Red 13 and Vincent both jumped aside as the stream struck the ground between them. It burned a searing hole into the ground and the smell of burning grass lifted up into the air. Running forward, Cloud drew his sword and leapt up into the air. He swung the blade with all his might, and as it swung a thin shield of flames swept across the metal. Palmer jumped aside just in time, but the flames singed at least a few of the gray-white hairs on his head and made him cry out. Palmer then darted across the top of the tiny Bronco, rubbing his head and calling out curses as he ran. His extra weight jumping about the plane made it shake and tilt from side to side, and because of his attack Cloud was in a precarious position, and was finding it hard to keep his balance. He eventually lost the battle for balance and fell forward onto the plane's controls, his hand accidentally falling on the switch-on button. All at once the plane came to life. The engine gave a loud chug-chug as it coughed into life, before settling into a gentle rhythmic motion. The propellers on the plane's wings slowly began to turn, gradually picking up speed. Thankfully they were slow to warm up, and it would be about a minute or more before they picked up enough speed to take off. Meanwhile Palmer had jumped off the plane, and was now locked in a fierce battle with Eris and Tifa. Eris raised her staff and swung it out in front of her, aiming for Palmer's head. She missed his head as he dodged, but with his arm raised she managed to knock the Mako gun from his hands, and fell down to the floor, skidding out of harm's way. With his weapon now gone, Palmer turned away, only to remember that Tifa was standing behind him. The young woman grabbed hold of Palmer's shoulders and pulling him towards her. She gave him an almighty kick in his solar plexus, which made him choke and groan loudly. She didn't stop there and lifted him straight up, giving him 2 sharp punches in his round face. Then she let him go, and Palmer went rolling to the floor. Incidentally, right by his Mako gun. And Vincent. While Palmer was busy struggling with Vincent and Barrett over possession of the Mako gun, Yuffie quickly darted around the side of the house, remembering something she had seen while she had been exploring the town earlier. She didn't just go to explore the materia shops. She leaped past the battle and skidded round the corner, her crafty eyes lighting up as she saw that it was still there. The Mako gun went flying through the air, and a single bullet from Vincent's expertly held pistol ended its usefulness. Palmer cried out in dismay as his beloved weapon and his last line of defense came crashing to the ground in pieces, the Mako energy slowly spilling onto the ground. Palmer sagged heavily, realizing that he was beaten. Looking up, he saw the others standing in a line in front of him with stern looks on their faces. Suddenly Palmer pointed up behind them and cried out, and when they all looked they also cried out and quickly ducked down to the ground. The wing of the plane passed slowly overhead, casting a dark shadow over them as it passed. Palmer also had to duck down to avoid the wing and its lethal propellers, but as it passed by he saw his chance to escape. While the others were busy climbing to their feet, he jumped up and fled, darting across the backyard. He didn't get very far. As he was running, the roar of another engine came to life, and a dark green blur suddenly came zooming out of the driveway. Palmer had no chance to stop or dodge the truck as it came past. He was slammed into the side of the truck and bounced straight off, rolling across the grass until he slumped into an unconscious heap in the bushes. Behind the wheel Yuffie grinned happily, smug and self-satisfied that she had been able to injure a member of the Shinra. She was a little miffed when no one praised her for her efforts, until she realized that everyone was gathered around the tiny Bronco. By now the plane's propellers were spinning wildly, and already the plane was slowly beginning to fight and tug to get off the ground. Eris climbed up alongside Cloud and looked down at the controls. The propellers were moving so fast now that they created a strong updraft that blew Eris's hair all around her face, and she could barely see the controls. Everything looked so complicated that she had no idea which button to press in order to get the plane to stop, and the propellers weren't about to slow down, either.
"It won't stop!"
she shouted to Cloud over the roar of the propellers.
"It's going to take off,"
said Red 13. Cloud shook his head.
"Forget it,"
he said, his voice barely audible.
"Get in."
Everyone obeyed and jumped onto the plane, just as it began to tug a little more and attempted to rise off the ground. Yuffie made it only just in time, diving from the truck and grabbing into the edge of the wing, just as it began to finally rise into the air, carrying Cloud and the others with it. The plane moved forward and rose steadily off the ground. It just missed hitting the back fence and rose higher and further, slowly pulling away from Sid's house. A strong gust of wind turned the abandoned lever to the left, and the plane complied in turn. It swiftly rose up and spun round, narrowly missing the tilting rocket as it headed back into Rocket Town. Down on the ground, Sid and Rufus looked up in amazement as the tiny Bronco came swerving around the rocket. Someone must have pressed on the lever again, for the plane came swooping down towards the ground. It narrowly missed Rufus and his guard and zoomed steadily past. Sid looked around for a second before he pushed past the soldier and began to run rapidly after the plane. Cloud turned around on the plane and looked down at Sid running after the plane. He wished he could slow the plane down a bit and get him on board, but the Shinra soldier was now firing at them and they couldn't afford to slow down. Besides, he didn't know which button it was anyway, and the plane was picking up speed. As it turned out, he didn't need to know anyway. With the plane still trying to gain speed, Sid was catching up to them, although soon the plane would be moving too fast for him to catch up. As he neared the tail end of the plane, he jumped with all his might and grabbed onto the end of the wing. He held on with all his strength as the plane began to rise again, picking up in speed. The Shinra soldier continued to fire, even as the plane began to rise and head speedily out of his sight. He must have had either good sight or excellent aim, for the next bullet he fired went zipping through the air and struck the tail end of the plane, cutting a giant hole in the tail. The plane shuddered violently and dropped about a meter out of the air, smoke pouring from the tail.
"Shit! The tail's been hit!"
Sid shouted, glancing back at the smoking tail.
"Emergency landing,"
said Cloud. Sid nodded and turned back to the front of the plane, gripping onto the frame.
"This is gonna be a big splash,"
he warned them all.
"Hold on to your drawers and don't piss in 'em."
The plane's engine chugged again and dropped another meter out of the air, before it very slowly began to descend. Looking ahead they could see the ocean of the west part of the continent, which meant they were going to crash in the ocean for sure. They passed by the shore and continued to descend, heading straight for the water. As Sid warned, it was a big splash. The plane landed in the water and almost bounced off the top, as though it was a stone that had been skidded across the top of a smooth, calm lake. But this was no lake and certainly wasn't smooth. A spray over water came pounding up the side of the plane, sending cold droplets down onto the group as they struggled to hold onto the plane, holding onto anything they could to stop themselves from falling and drowning in the water. The crash wasn't as bad as they had feared. Although the plane landed heavily, it stayed above the water and did not sink, and even as the roar of the splashing water died down they could still hear the faint chug of the engine, showing that the plane was still usable. Although, there was one thing.
"She won't fly anymore,"
Sid said, disappointed. He ran his hand through the water, feeling the gaping hole in the tail wing, which was half submerged in water. They needed the tail wing to fly, and without that, the tiny Bronco would never make it off the ground without crashing again. Cloud sighed heavily. That was a huge blow to them, but not a completely disadvantageous one. They had wanted to use the tiny Bronco because of its ability to fly, but as he looked around at the plane, he had another idea.
"Can't we use it as a boat?"
he asked curiously.
"For fuck's sake!"
Sid cursed.
"Do whatever you want."
Cloud looked round at the others. They all felt a little guilty about the way things had turned out, especially for Sid. The tiny Bronco had meant so much to him, and now because of them and the Shinra, it had been taken away from him.
"Sid, what are you going to do?"
he asked. Sid pulled his hand up from the water and sat up on the edge of the plane, thinking it over.
Dunno,
He admitted finally.
I'm history with the Shinra and I've given up on the town. How about your wife? How about Shara? Wife.
Sid spat, choking back a laugh.
Don't make me laugh. Just thinking about marrying her gives me the chills. What are you guys gonna do? We're going after a man named Sephiroth,
Cloud explained.
We'll have to get Rufus of the Shinra someday too.
Sid stared at Cloud, wondering if he was serious. When he saw Cloud's expression didn't change and he realized he was, he said,
I don't know about any of that, but...
He closed his eyes and thought for a second, before he stood up, grabbed his spear and put it firmly over his shoulder.
What the hell? Sign me up.
Cloud couldn't help but smile a little. He somehow figured that Sid would say that. Still, he needed approval from the others to make it official.
How about it, everyone?
He asked, waiting for their answer. One by one the others looked round at each other. Then Eris stood up on the plane, making it rock a little, and said,
I'm all for it.
The others then slowly nodded their own approval, and it was then that it became official. Sid smirked proudly.
Glad to be aboard, numbskulls.
He said. Cloud tilted his head.
Numbskulls?
He asked. Sid nodded.
Yeah. Anyone stupid enough to go up against Shinra nowadays has gotta be a numbskull. I like it. So, where we headed? Rufus was going after Sephiroth towards the Temple of the Ancients. Really?
Cloud exclaimed, almost falling from the plane and into the water.
Where is it? That Temple of the Ancients?
Sid thought carefully for a moment, before he finally shrugged.
Dunno,
he said.
That numbskull kid was telling me he was heading the wrong direction.
He pointed out in the direction they were facing, towards the west.
So maybe it's off this way.
Cloud turned around and looked out at the ocean. There was another continent visible in the distance, probably no more than an hour's ride from their current location. And they still had a good few hours of daylight left, so they wouldn't need to worry about traveling at night. Still.
Let's just head for land and get some information,
he suggested.
Temple of the Ancients. That name bothers me.
End of part 06. Next part, part 07, Treachery. End of chapter. Episode 14, part 07, chapter 14. Part 7, Treachery. Chapter 14. A whole hour passed by before they finally reached land again, touching the shores of the far western continent. The plane slowed and got stuck in the sand close to the shore, so Barrett, Cloud, and Sid had to jump out into the surf and drag the plane up onto the beach. They dragged the plane as high up as they could so that the tide would not drag it back out to sea after it came in. After all, they didn't want to be stranded on this new continent. While the plane was being pulled up onto the beach, Eris walked away from the group and strolled leisurely across the sand. The ocean's tide came up close to her boots as she walked and she could feel the spray of the waves against her face and arms, blown up by the breeze. She stopped next to a gathering of large rocks piled up alongside a small cliff. They seemed fairly stable, so Eris placed her staff down on the ground and began to climb. She climbed carefully, placing one boot in front of the other and grasping onto the jutting out rocks for balance. When she finally reached the topmost rock, she sat down and looked out into the distance. It was an absolutely beautiful view. She could see the ocean for miles around, as well as the faint line of the other continent at the top of the horizon. That land seemed to stretch out to the left as far as she could see, and she wondered where it ended. She believed she could even see the tower of Cosmo Canyon, but that could easily have been another mountain. Breathing in, Eris felt her lungs fill full of fresh sea air. The salty taste woke her senses and pushed away the fatigue and stress of their journey. She could hear nothing but the ocean crashing loudly against the rocks, sending clouds of spray up into the air. One particularly large wave hit the rock in front of her, and spray flew up and fell down over her. It was cool against her skin, and as she opened her eyes and watched the spray fall, she could think of no better moment than this. Moments like these were what she treasured the most, and she wanted to just get lost in the moment. She almost did, until she looked down at the rocks beside her.
Oh. Yuffie.
Yuffie was standing on the sand next to Eris's staff. She seemed startled when Eris called out to her and looked up in surprise, before a cheerful smile spread on the ninja's face. She gave Eris a little wave before jumping expertly across the rocks to where Eris was sitting. Eris shifted over a little as Yuffie jumped up to her, and the youthful ninja sat herself down on the rock.
It's a nice alcove, isn't it?
Yuffie said, sounding somewhat serious for the first time. Eris nodded.
Yes, it is,
she replied.
When I was in Midgar, I remember reading about places like this, but I never thought I'd actually get to see them.
She pulled her knees up to her chest and leaned her head back, eyes closed, as though she was listening quietly to something.
I wonder what they call this place. The mountains of the Korii no Senshi.
Eris opened her eyes and looked at Yuffie. She said. Yuffie sighed heavily and slowly climbed to her feet, looking out at the clear blue ocean.
The mountains, and the land surrounding them, are known as the mountains of the Korii no Senshi, or mountains of the ancient warriors, she said.
She put her arms behind her back and began to walk slowly across the rock.
All the powerful ninjas of Wutai fought here in the past. They fought here to protect Wutai.
She stopped suddenly and turned back to Eris, blushing.
Or so I've heard.
Eris was about to ask Yuffie a little more about what she meant, but as she was about to speak she heard Cloud's voice calling out to them above the waves. She looked past Yuffie's shoulder and saw Cloud with all the others. They were standing away from the beach now, at the entrance to a steep and rocky path leading up to the top of the first cliff. Cloud waved at them, signaling for them to hurry up.
We're coming.
Yuffie called back. She looked back at Eris and winked, before she turned away and jumped down off the rocks in one long leap. She landed perfectly on the ground and darted off to the others, back to her usual hyper nature. When Eris had finished carefully climbing down the rocks and caught up to the others, they headed on up the path. It was much steeper than they first thought, so they took their time and headed up steadily so they wouldn't tire. Even so it wasn't long until their muscles were burning from the effort of walking, and had to slow down even more. They walked almost in single file, with Cloud and Red 13 leading the way while Yuffie and Cat were lagging behind at the back. Cat was the furthest back, his Mog body finding it difficult to maneuver across the rocks. He had to go really slow and walk around the bigger ridges, and spent a lot of time fiddling with his controls and muttering to himself. Eventually Cloud and Red 13 reached the top of the path and stepped onto the cliff. Up here the air was cooler and much breezier, and ruffled Red 13's fur. The hound opened his mouth wide and flared his nostrils. Like that he was able to catch almost every scent that the wind brought with it, mostly the scent of the ocean and the mountains around them. One by one the others caught up to them and stood on the top of the cliff, looking around.
Wait, wa it.
Everyone turned around in surprise as Yuffie came running up the mountain path. At first they thought she was being chased by a monster, until they saw that there was nothing following her. Yuffie used the scattered rocks on the ground to jump her way around the group, before finally landing in front of them. She stood firm and spread her arms wide, preventing them from going any further.
What is it, all of a sudden?
Cat said, flailing his arms as he tried to keep his Mog body from falling over onto its back.
Don't scare me like that. What they?
Said Tifa, catching her breath.
Did something happen?
Yuffie shook her head. She then pointed to the path behind her, where the rocky cliff stopped and an old wooden bridge crossed the gap.
I know this area pretty well,
she informed them.
It gets pretty tough past here. Better get ready.
Silence greeted her words. The group slowly looked from one to the other, not entirely convinced by Yuffie's words. The disbelief showed on their faces, and when they eventually turned back to Yuffie, Tifa folded her arms.
Really?
She asked. She looked closely at Yuffie's face, trying to find any signs of deception in the mischievous ninja's eyes. Although there were no signs, she still wasn't convinced.
Something's telling me I still shouldn't trust you. Are you thinking of tricking us again?
She was of course referring to the day that they first encountered Yuffie, in the forests just outside of Junon. She had managed to trick them then and stole their materia, until they finally caught her and got it back. Even after all this time they still found themselves holding shreds of doubt about Yuffie's true intentions. Yuffie stared at them in what looked like surprise and shock, and she shook her head fiercely.
No.
She protested.
It's really tough.
She tried her best to look as earnest as she could, trying her hardest to convince them. It almost worked, until...
There they are, catch 'em.
Cloud looked up. His eyes widened as he saw two Shinra soldiers running across the bridge towards them, their rifles at the ready. Before anyone had a chance to move or realize what was happening, the soldiers had run up and surrounded them. They raised their rifles and aimed at the group.
Shinra!
Cloud exclaimed.
It's Shinra!
Shouted Red 13 at the same time, snarling loudly. The two soldiers stood firm, the barrels of their guns held steady as they gazed slowly upon the 9 people in front of them. None of the 9 moved. They didn't even dare reach towards their weapons in case the soldiers chose to open fire on them. The soldiers gazed from one person to the other.
Hey, that's not them!
One of them said finally.
These are the other guys from before.
While all this was going on, Yuffie was hopping frantically from one foot to the other. Her face was pale and she looked extremely anxious, as though she had been caught out. Tifa saw the nervous look in the young girl's eyes and gasped, realizing the truth.
Yuffie, you're not. So what does this mean?
Said Vincent calmly, his hand slowly twitching towards his gun. He turned his red eyes over to Yuffie, giving her a frightful glance.
You will explain this later.
Yuffie stopped hopping and stared, confused. Then she realized what they were suggesting and she jumped fiercely.
I didn't know.
She protested, desperate to prove her innocence to them.
I have nothing to do with this one.
Suddenly she clamped her hands over her mouth, realizing that she had made a fateful mistake. She was much too late, for everyone had heard her.
What do you mean this one?
Barrett demanded furiously. He ignored the soldiers and raised his gun arm, pointing the barrel straight towards Yuffie.
This one. So you were planning something?
He cocked the barrel of his gun.
No,
Yuffie stammered fearfully. She bit hard on her tongue, deciding that maybe silence was better than trying to explain. The 2 Shinra soldiers continued to stand and stare at the group in front of them, unsure of what they should do. Even though this wasn't the group they had been sent out to get, they did know that Shinra wanted them as well. One of the soldiers turned to his comrade.
What should we do?
He asked. The second soldier said, unsure. He thought for a second, before he nodded and turned back to the first soldier.
Get them. Grab them and ask questions later.
He then darted forward, gun at the ready, set to capture them. He knew from the very start that it was futile trying to capture them. They were a group of 9, and his group consisted of only 2 soldiers. They were heavily outnumbered. Even so, orders were orders and he didn't dare to disobey Heidegger or President Rufus. Sure enough, as he approached Cloud and the others, the tables turned in their favor, and the group took advantage of the situation. The soldiers fired too late, the group were right up close and their rifles were useless. Weapons were drawn and zipped past at amazing speeds, and the loud clash of metal striking more metal could be heard. Seconds later 2 rifles were flung into the air and fell to the ground, crashing and clattering on the rock. Those rifles were quickly followed by the bodies of the 2 Shinra soldiers, both of them unconscious and their helmets covered in dents. They weren't dead, but they would surely wake up in a few hours with terrible headaches. With the 2 soldiers safely dealt with and unconscious, Tifa put her hands on her hips and turned back to the others, her face angry.
What's going on?
She demanded.
I thought something was fishy.
She stretched her arms out in front of her, and something caught her eye. Normally the materia slots around her gloves were full, but as she stretched she saw that every one of the slots were empty.
My materia is missing!
She exclaimed in horror. At that point everyone started checking their weapons and armor, and at the same time they all realized that every single piece of materia they owned was missing. Every summon, every magic, every support. Every single ball of materia had been smoothly taken from their slots, and were nowhere to be seen. Pockets were checked and the ground was searched, but it was no use. The materia was gone.
Hey!
Eris said suddenly.
Where's Yuffie?
It was a very good question. Everyone looked around again, this time looking for Yuffie. When the battle had started they had been a group of 9. Now that the battle was over, they were left with just 8 people. She must have run off at the start of the battle, using the soldiers as a diversion so she could escape. It was then that the final pieces slipped into place, and they understood everything. The way Yuffie had been hanging around by Ares' staff back at the alcove, and the way she had jumped around everyone before stopping them. She must have been stealing the last of the materia then. And now she had run off, taking the materia with her.
She's done it to us again!
Tifa shouted angrily, stamping her foot hard on the ground. She was furious that Yuffie had managed to trick them out of their materia for a second time.
I'm never gonna forgive her. She was after our materia from the beginning. I won't let her get away with it. I'm pretty sure she ran off north. Let's go after her.
She looked back at Cloud, who nodded. The materia was an important part of their equipment, they couldn't let Yuffie take them just like that. They had no choice but to go after her. Cloud turned and nodded at the others, and then together they all began to run off to the north, in the hopes that they were following the same path as Yuffie.
Yuffie. Yuffie.
There was no answer to their calls, but then again they didn't really expect an answer. It wasn't as though Yuffie was going to come out of her own free will and hand herself over to them. When they first set off, they didn't think Yuffie could have gotten away so quickly. Yet the mountains were vast, winding, and there were many little crevices and hidden paths that Yuffie could probably use to evade them. And the longer they searched, the harder it would be to find her. Unlike the other continents they had visited, which were covered in vast plains of grass and wild monsters, this continent was covered seemingly from head to foot with tall, rocky hills and small cliffs. There were wild monsters, they could see the oversized bizarre bugs nesting in the darker crevices, ready to lash out when anyone came near. At any rate, the bizarre bugs would probably only attack them if they split up, so as long as they stayed together the monsters would most likely leave them alone.
This is hopeless,
said Tifa, kicking at the rocks. She ran her hands through her hair and tugged hard, her body pushed to the breaking point in her anger. When she was finished pulling her hair she spun around to face the others, who were all sitting on rocks behind her.
She could be absolutely anywhere by now.
Red 13 stretched out on the rock he was lying on and put his head on his paws.
I caught her scent a little while ago when we crossed the bridges,
he said.
But after that her scent vanished. I cannot smell her at all now.
He snorted loudly and put a paw over his face.
Well, we can't give up,
Tifa replied obstinately. She clenched her fists tightly.
That's our materia. She had no right to steal it.
Sid was leaning against a rocky wall right then, twirling his spear loosely in his hands.
Ain't no chance of finding her now,
he said.
That kid's slippery as an eel. She's probably far away from here by now.
He glanced down at the ground next to him, and suddenly thrust his spear down. The sharp blade pierced the hard outer shell of the bizarre bug with a loud crack, going straight to the vulnerable inner parts of the oversized insect. The bug squealed and shuffled for a second, until its legs crumpled up and its antennae fell limp. Seconds later the insect shuddered again and its body turned black and charred as though it was burning from the inside. Then, before their eyes, the bizarre bug began to crumble apart and disintegrate, its body turning into dust. Sid lifted his spear and twirled it in his hands once again.
Or lost,
he added gruffly. Eris lowered her head, thinking back to when she and Yuffie were sitting on the rock in the alcove. The way Yuffie had spoken and the fact that she knew the area? Did that mean something?
I don't think she's lost,
she said.
I think Yuffie lives around here.
She looked up.
That's why she knows the area. She must do. We won't give up just yet,
Cloud said firmly.
It's still a few hours before dark. We'll find her.
He then stood up and walked a few paces away, before he stopped and looked to his left, towards the mountains. Just beneath the mountain was a short rocky ledge, short compared to the mountains, anyway. It seemed to come away from the mountain and came forward in a sort of fold, overlapping part of the mountain. Where Cloud was he could see just behind that fold, and after taking a few more paces forward Cloud could see what it was. It was another bridge, just like the two they had to cross over in order to get to where they were in the first place. Like the other bridges this one was aged and was missing a few planks here and there, and sloped upwards to another rocky ledge that disappeared over its horizon, meaning it swept back down again. Until then the fold of rock had hidden the bridge from view, but now it was visible.
There are still a few places we haven't looked yet,
he said, glancing at the others. He then pointed to the rocky fold and the bridge beyond, and the others came and stood behind him. They all stared at the bridge for a second, and then they all began to head towards it. They passed the rocky fold and walked carefully across the rickety old bridge, until they eventually stood on the top of the rocky ledge beyond enough. As they had thought, the ledge sloped steadily down towards the land that made up the rest of the new continent. The last part of the continent varied compared to the rest of it. Up until then all they had seen was a dry rocky land and mountains on all sides, but as the ledge swept downwards that rocky ground became more scattered as grass grew. Eventually the rock disappeared altogether, leaving behind another vast, grassy plain for them to cross. Although it was a disappointment to see grassy plains again, it was a relief to be out of the mountains at last. Cloud stepped forward away from the others and put his hands above his eyes, shielding them from the bright afternoon sun, and looked around. There was still no sign of Yuffie, nor any sign that she had been here. However, there was one promising sign not too far from where they were. A number of small structures dotted the ground, as well as one very large structure he couldn't see well.
A village,
he said aloud.
And a mountain? I wonder. Is that where Yuffie is?
End of chapter. Episode 15, Part 07, Chapter 15. Chapter 15. It felt like stepping into a different world passing through the gates of Wutai. It was as though they had left behind a world of grassy plains and wild, threatening monsters, and instead had entered a dimension that was calm and tranquil. It was an absolutely beautiful village, unlike anything they had ever seen before. It also carried with it an air of mystery and seclusion, seeming as though the wheels of time had stopped completely to keep this village in its beautiful, picturesque state. They could tell right away that it was a ninja town. The houses were large and hut-like, built mainly of wood that was painted shades of red and grey. The double doors were also made of wood and slid open, with thin but strong sheets of paper in place of windows. The roofs were made of black wood and were specially built so that they curled slightly inwards and upwards to a point, in true Oriental style. Looking at the few people that were wandering around, it was also possible to tell that this was Yuffie's home. The style of clothing was pretty much the same, tight and free of restriction, so they could grab their weapons at the first sign of trouble. There were also the telltale signs of a number of shurikens close to the hands of the people, although of many different designs. Running all the way through the village was a beautiful stream, filled with crystal clear water that carried a glorious blue shimmer to it, enhanced by the late afternoon sun. The water sparkled in such a way that it seemed as though the stars were shining in the water, their twinkling light reflected within the depths of the water. Floating on the lightly rippling surface was a number of flat green leaves, and a number of water lilies floated luxuriously alongside them. Cloud and the others came to a stop and looked around at the beautiful village, their eyes wide in awe. It truly felt like another world or a different time, and they were the invaders, intruding on their peaceful land. There was a lot more to see on the outskirts of the town. A large cluster of trees, tall and green, surrounded the back end of the town. Yet there was something else rising up out of the forest, even taller than the trees. It was a tall pagoda, with 5 levels packed one on top of the other, like a guard tower overlooking the town. What stood out the most, however, was the tall, rising cliff that bordered the northern part of the town. They only glanced at it briefly right then, but what they did see was a large statue carved into the side of the cliff. It was the statue of an ancient figure, a man, with many arms pointing in many directions, surrounded by the faces and figures of others.
Hey!
The group all turned and looked across the wooden bridge that crossed the stream. Yuffie was there, standing in front of a shop that had the sign weapon store written in big, black, fancy lettering on the front. Yuffie waved at them, grinning, and then delved into her pocket. She took out one of the balls of materia she had stolen and waved it about in the air as though taunting them, before she placed it back in her pocket, turned away, and ran off again. Cloud and the group followed as quickly as they could, running across the bridge towards the weapon store. Even as they ran, the villagers made no move to help them, they just watched and simply stepped out of the way as they ran past. It made sense, they would never catch one of their own. They lost sight of Yuffie after she crossed the second bridge, jumping around rapidly and then suddenly disappearing, just like that. Cloud's group crossed the bridge as well and came to a stop just in front of another shop. They looked around, but there was no sign of the girl. All they could see was the shop they were stood in front of, another shop across a third bridge, and a few wandering villagers. They thought they had lost the girl for good, until they heard a faint noise behind them. Cloud spun around just in time to see the wooden doors of the shop behind them slowly slide shut. Without even waiting to think about whether it was Yuffie who had shut the doors, Cloud stormed over and pushed them open again, barging straight into the shop with the sign Turtle Paradise above it. Then he stopped and stared straight ahead. He had barged straight into the local bar, and the moment he had entered his eyes had fallen on the table nearest to the door, and in particular the 3 people that were sat there. Those blue suits. The blonde-haired woman, the red-headed man, and the bald man. The Turks. Hearing the door slam open, Elena put down her drink and turned her head. Her eyes landed straight on Cloud's face, and after staring at him blankly for a few seconds, she suddenly realized who he was and jumped, almost knocking her drink over the table.
Why, you? How did you get here?
She demanded angrily. She then shook her head fiercely and got up out of her chair, kicking it back and raising her fists.
Never mind that. I guess it's fate that brought us together. Get ready to die.
The rest of the group came in then, standing behind Cloud as he stood staring at Elena. They saw the Turk standing with her fists clenched, and her two comrades sitting silently at the table. Hurriedly Tifa and the others all drew their weapons and pushed past Cloud and into the bar, surrounding the table in preparation for what seemed to be an inevitable fight. The rest of the bar fell silent, all eyes on the corner table. Only Cloud stayed where he was, not moving his eyes away from Elena. She glared back at him, her eyes so fierce and angry that there might as well have been flames burning inside of them. How could a woman so young have so much bloodthirst in her? Perhaps she wasn't bloodthirsty at all, Cloud thought silently. Perhaps she was just driven by her duty as a Turk.
Elena, you talk too much.
Elena gasped and lowered her fists, spinning round to face Reno.
What?
She asked, surprised. Reno didn't even look up at Elena. He just sighed and stuck his finger into his half-empty glass and slowly twirled the shrinking cubes of ice around the container. When he was done stirring them around, he flicked his hair out of his eyes and said,
"What are we doing way out here in the middle of nowhere?"
Elena blinked, confused by Reno's question.
"We're taking our vacation and resting up from our work,"
she replied. Slowly Reno nodded his head, and then raised his gaze. He glanced very briefly and without concern at Cloud and the others standing around the table, and then looked back at Elena.
"Now our vacation is ruined," he said. But... "Even the booze tastes bad now,"
said Rude, who was sitting across from Reno. The older Turk looked down into his own glass with a scowl on his face, as though he had just drank something old and rotting. He put the glass on the table and pushed it away from him, not prepared to drink any more. Elena looked from Reno to Rude, and then looked back at Reno. Reno had turned away from her and was drinking out of his glass again. She couldn't believe that they were actually going to ignore Cloud and his group, right when they had walked in on them. Even if they were on their vacation.
"Sorry,"
she said finally, giving in and sitting back down in her chair, pulling it back towards the table. She was about to grab her glass again when she stopped, and gave Cloud another fierce glare.
You're lucky all right. Now get out of my sight. The next time we meet I won't be so nice."
With the immediate tension subsided, Cloud and the others put away their weapons and quickly left the bar, since it was clear that Yuffie was not there. As they left, Tifa carefully slid the bar doors shut again, although it was served no purpose other than to make her feel a little safer. Not that anyone could feel entirely safe knowing that the Turks were on the other side of that door. They were a little bit cautious with the next shop they entered, this time an item and materia store in the far north of the town, close to the entrance to the cliff. A young girl was looking at them curiously as they entered the store, peering out from behind the wall with a peculiar smile on her young face. As they disappeared inside the shop, she disappeared behind the wall again and sniggered, her hands over her mouth so she couldn't be heard. There was a definite air of tension inside the item shop. As Cloud and the others entered, the shopkeeper seemed to tense up and quickly moved to the back of his store, pulling a cloth over some small, glittering items he had stored there. Even the other customers in the shop seemed nervous, giving the group suspicious, sideways glances.
"What's their problem?"
asked Barrett, looking around at the people. As he met their gazes, they quickly turned away, pretending to be browsing through the items.
"They have something to hide,"
Vincent replied calmly, folding his arms. Cloud walked forward into the shop, and the others followed close behind. They could feel the gazes of the people on them, watching them with sudden anxiety as they headed further into the shop. The shopkeeper pretended to ignore them, although even he was watching them with keen interest. Suddenly Cloud stopped and turned his head round, looking at all corners of the shop. There was no sign of Yuffie, but that didn't mean that she wasn't hiding somewhere. They couldn't ask outright if Yuffie was hiding behind the till or something like that, they could only search. And search they did. Like the customers, they pretended to browse through the shop's items, although in reality they were searching for any signs of Yuffie's presence in the shop. Yet there was nothing. If Yuffie was in the shop, then she had hid herself away spectacularly. Cloud headed to the back of the shop and searched along the back wall. While he was moving on to the next wall, he came across a chest that was partially hidden amongst the shop's inventory. Curious, he leaned over and quietly opened the chest, taking a quick peek inside. If he ever needed proof that the shop did sell materia, this was it. Inside the chest was a single light ball of materia, a type he hadn't seen before. He lifted it up out of the chest and looked inside, trying to see if there was a faint image contained inside. He was about to stand up and ask the shopkeeper directly about the materia and about Yuffie, when he suddenly heard a loud creaking noise coming from above him. He looked up, and a dark blur suddenly dropped down in front of him. While he was startled, Cloud felt his hand being quickly pried open and the ball of materia snatched from his hands, before the blur suddenly moved again, heading out of the shop. Yuffie didn't pause or wait as she bolted out of the shop, jumping straight over Cat and ducking underneath Sid's spear as he swiped it, trying to knock her over. This time she didn't stop or taunt them and ran straight out, a superior grin on her face as she darted across the ground. She knew Cloud and the others were chasing her, but she had an advantage, speed, and knowledge of the village. The girl leapt expertly over the bridges, rushing across them to find her next hideaway place. She headed straight for one particular house close to the entrance of the village, taking a quick peek behind her to see if Cloud and the others were following her. For a moment she had a clear run, and so she bolted into the house. There was an old man and a young boy in the house, and as Yuffie forced her way into the house, the boy turned and exclaimed at her loudly. Yuffie ignored him and turned back to the door, peering through to see where Cloud and the others were. To her surprise, she saw them crossing the bridge close to where she was, and she quickly jumped, panicked, and ran straight behind a small foldable paper curtain in the corner of the room. She looked up for a second before pulling the curtain around her, hiding herself from view. Cloud and the others came running into the house, this time certain that they had seen Yuffie run inside. As they ran in, the young boy turned to face them, scowled at them angrily, and put his hands on his hips.
"Oh no! More weirdos!"
he complained loudly, not looking too happy to see yet more people barging into his house. He paused and looked at them a little more closely, eyeing them up and down.
"No, these aren't like the one from a while ago, but these ones look weird too."
The old man, clearly the boy's grandfather, looked up and gazed at Cloud through squinted eyes. He gazed for a moment or two, before a smile spread on his wrinkly old face.
Well,
he said cheerfully.
"Long time no see. What have you been up to? Let's see. What was your name?"
The kid rolled his eyes and ran over to his grandfather, giving him a playful but harsh dig in his arm.
"No, Gramps,"
he said fiercely.
"This isn't anyone you know. This is just some stranger who barged into our house."
Cloud and his group stood still, looking more than a little embarrassed at having made another scene barging into someone's private home. Cloud wished he had learned after the Turtle Paradise incident not to just run into people's homes. But they had been so sure they had seen Yuffie run in here. That fact was soon confirmed, as the boy continued to speak.
"What are we going to do, Gramps? Some strange-looking girl came in here a minute ago and I..."
The boy was suddenly silenced as a loud and angry hushing sound came from the corner of the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. Everyone turned at the same time towards the corner where the noise came from, and saw the foldable curtain hiding the corner away. Cloud nodded at Tifa, who walked straight over to the curtain and pulled it away, revealing the corner. As they expected, Yuffie was hiding behind it, on her knees and ducking down with her head held between her hands, eyes squeezed shut. She felt the breeze of the curtain being pulled back and slowly lifted her head. Her gaze was met by the angry faces of Tifa and the others, each of them staring at her with fierce intensity. She mumbled silently, realizing she was caught. At that second Tifa made to grab her, but Yuffie was one step ahead, already up and moving around the room. She jumped out from the corner and moved swiftly, dodging past anyone before heading straight for the door. Red 13 tried to take a snap at her ankles as she dived past, but she was too quick even for his reflexes and bit only the air. They all piled out of the house again. Because of the small doorway and the size of their group, they almost got stuck as they tried to force their way out. Somehow they managed it without getting jammed and ran out into the street again, looking around at Yuffie. They were too late again. There was no sign of the girl anywhere. There hadn't been enough time for her to get too far, so she must be somewhere around. Yet as they looked around there was no sign of her, as though she had completely vanished. At that moment the wind suddenly began to change direction for a brief moment, now beginning to blow from the west rather than the east towards Cloud and the others. Red 13 raised his head as he caught a familiar scent on the air, one that he recognized and was fairly close. However, just to be sure, he walked forward and sniffed again. Sure enough, the scent was there, coming from the west. The others watched him patiently, until Red 13 finally nodded and turned to them. "Over here," he growled, and began to run off across the bridge. Everyone followed Red 13 closely as he darted across the bridge, his head held high to catch the last traces of the scent on the breeze before it switched back to its ordinary direction. He was halfway across the second bridge when the wind changed back and the scent was lost, but Red 13 had got enough of it to know that Yuffie was somewhere around the immediate vicinity. With the others standing around, Red 13 lowered his head to the ground and began to sniff again. It took him a second or two to pick up the scent again from the ground, but when he found it he followed it closely, keeping his nose to the ground. His nose led him past the door to the turtle paradise, and over towards a large stone barrel that stood just next to the wall. Red 13 circled the barrel, and then gently climbed up the side to where the stone lid was resting slightly ajar. He was careful not to get too close or sniff too loudly, but when he finally jumped down and looked at Cloud, he nodded confidently. Cloud nodded back, and signaled to the others to get into position. They moved instantly, splitting up and guarding the two bridges that led to the rest of the town. Eris, Sid, and Barrett took the northern bridge leading to the item shop, while Tifa, Vincent and Kat took the eastern bridge, blocking off the way to the weapon shop. With everyone in position, Cloud and Red 13 both turned to the barrel. Cloud strolled up cautiously and peered through the gap created by the stone lid, but all he could see was blackness. He then stepped away from the barrel and punched out with his fist, hitting the side of the barrel with all his might. His fist connected hard with the side of the barrel, and the sound of his punch echoed loudly inside the barrel. Cloud hit it again, and the echo sounded once more. He hit it fiercely one more time, before a pair of hands burst out of the side and pushed the lid away, and Yuffie leapt out of the barrel. The girl landed and tried to flee, dodging the swift snaps of Red 13's jaws as he again tried to bite her ankles and stop her fleeing. Yuffie spun round and ran towards the eastern bridge, only to see that her route was blocked by Tifa, Vincent, and Kat, who had their weapons ready to use against her if she tried to pass. Seeing that there was no way she could pass, Yuffie turned the other way and headed towards the northern bridge, hoping to cross into the safety of the forest. She soon skidded to a stop as she saw that bridge was blocked off, too, with Barrett, Eris and Sid standing in her way. Without thinking, Yuffie turned around again and headed back, but quickly stopped as she saw Cloud and Red 13 standing directly behind her. She turned around but remembered all her exits were blocked. It then hit her that she was trapped and she sagged heavily, shaking her head. Seeing this, Cloud stepped forward.
"You can't get away, Yuffie,"
he told her sternly. Yuffie looked up through meek eyes and looked around at the others, who were slowly advancing on her. She knew she had no way out, and she also knew that playing the sweet and innocent was not going to get her out of this mess. Knowing this, she sighed heavily, and regretfully nodded her head.
"Oh. Okay,"
she said timidly, her voice barely a whisper.
"I know. I was wrong. You win. I'll give you back your materia."
Cloud then motioned for her to move and Yuffie complied, walking slowly and shyly down the middle of the group towards the eastern bridge. The others followed close behind her, Barrett staying especially close so he had the girl within his range, just in case she tried to make a break for it. While Yuffie led them off to the other end of Wutai, two blue-uniformed Shinra soldiers came running down from the far west of the town, from where the pagoda stood. They looked around aimlessly for a second before crossing the northern bridge, heading for the Turtle Paradise bar. They peered through the paper sheet for a second, before they ran straight into the bar, running to the three Turks that were still sitting around the table.
"So our reports were right,"
one of the soldiers shouted as they stopped beside the Turks' table. Elena stood up as they approached, but Reno and Rude didn't flinch.
"He is here on vacation. We finally found him. Get the Turks here for backup."
The two soldiers waited for the Turks to make a move. They expected the three to jump up out of their chairs and help out right away, and were incredibly surprised when none of the three Turks moved. Instead, Reno just looked down at his glass, now his fourth in a line of empty glasses, and didn't look at the soldiers.
"What a drag,"
he grumbled, pushing the glass away. The two soldiers gasped and looked at each other in surprise, wondering what Reno meant. The first soldier then turned back.
What was that?"
he asked. Reno sighed heavily, and reached out for yet another glass lined up on the table. By now of course the ice had melted, and Reno frowned.
"Right now we're off duty and can't run off to save your butts. We know you're off duty, but if you knew that, then don't bother us."
Reno snapped, suddenly sounding angry as he slammed down his glass and spun round to face the two soldiers, an irritated glare in his eyes.
"Looking at you is making me sober."
The two soldiers seemed taken aback by Reno's aggressive attitude. They looked at Rude, who was looking at them through his black shades but saying nothing, his lips pursed tightly together. Elena was looking at Reno in equal surprise, completely confused.
But you all have orders from headquarters to look for him too.
The first soldier protested. Reno replied by picking up his glass and taking a huge mouthful out of it, swirling it around his mouth before swallowing it in one loud gulp. The soldier stared in disbelief 1 second more, before he frowned and shook his fist at Reno.
All right, that's it.
He shouted.
We'll get him without any help from the Turks, just you see.
Reno shrugged, not really caring what the soldiers did. The soldier growled angrily and then stormed out of the turtle paradise, his comrade firmly in tow. Seconds later the soldier returned again, still glaring at Reno through his visor.
And don't think that headquarters isn't going to hear about this.
He shouted threateningly, before he turned and walked back out again, sliding the doors shut behind him. Again Reno shrugged, and turned back to his drink. Elena watched silently as the two soldiers stormed off, hearing them grumble all the way outside the bar. She felt a little awkward, as she had never disobeyed a direct order from headquarters before. She couldn't believe that Reno was acting in this way, disobeying an order. Thinking that started to make her angry, and she spun around to face him.
Reno, do you think that was really such a good idea?
She demanded, losing her temper to Reno's laid-back attitude.
I mean, is that the way a professional, a Turk would act? Elena,
Reno said to her calmly, speaking in such a way that it made Elena's blood boil even more.
Don't misunderstand. A pro isn't someone who sacrifices himself for his job. That's just a fool.
Elena stared at him, her fists clenched and shaking, unable to believe her ears. She turned to face Rude.
Rude,
she said, hoping that at least Rude would see sense. To her utmost dismay, Rude said nothing to agree with her. He simply sighed and looked away from her, placing his glass on the table. Was all he could muster. Elena frowned.
Well, I don't buy that.
She snapped.
Goodbye.
And with that she walked out of the bar, leaving Rude and Reno behind. When she was gone, Rude looked up at the door, which was still open. He muttered silently.
Relax,
Reno assured him.
She's not a child. Let her have her way now.
He then downed the rest of his glass, and signaled to the barman for another healthy round. End of chapter.